So, hello, everyone. My name is Mark Hand. I'm the Pennsylvania GreenGov Council Director. And today's Carbon Reductions Commitments and Progress webinar is the first of our six-part series. Most topics in our series for this go-around focus on climate, and rightfully so. Next Friday, we will have a DEP-led discussion on PA's entry in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Emission or Gas Initiative, also called RGGI. In January, we'll be learning about Pennsylvania's new Climate Leadership Academy, followed by a Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center presentation on recycling and also the embodied carbon considerations when you're selecting various products. And then in March, we'll have a presentation focused on community sustainability and resilience, centered around foodways and healthcare. And then we'll end the series in April of 2022. Our final presentation will be held. The presenters will be the Public Utility Commission on household carbon reduction opportunities. And I just wanted to circle back with the Pennsylvania Climate Academy as something to highlight for everyone. The Climate Academy is a new offering in Pennsylvania, and its purpose is to advance climate preparedness and economic vitality and public health. The Pennsylvania Climate Academy Advisory Board is made up of state, local government, academia, and other community members and leaders that guide the Academy activities. And over time, the Climate Academy will provide a wide range of training and education opportunities targeting elected officials, local governments, critical infrastructure organizations, businesses, industry, and agricultural organizations, as well as nonprofits. And the reason why I bring up the PA Climate Academy is because while we do have a sustainability series coming up that's going to cover this in January, there is also a climate activator series. It's a 3-part training program that'll start around the same time as our sustainability series kickoff for that in January on that discussion. So please do visit paclimateacademy.org. We'll also follow up afterwards with the link, and consider signing up for and looking around the website and signing up for this a climate activator series. It's a really great series, and just hope that you'll join with that. And now I'd like to introduce and turn the program over to our partner at Penn State Sustainability Institute, Peter Boger. Peter Boger is the Assistant Director for Community Engagement at Penn State University's Sustainability Institute, and is responsible for developing programs and partnerships that help Penn State leverage its resources to promote sustainability throughout the Commonwealth. And Peter, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Really delighted to be part of this series once again. As Mark mentioned, this is the third go-round in our partnership on this webinar series between the GreenGov Council and the Sustainability Institute. And for us, this makes total sense as to why we're doing this. The Sustainability Institute is essentially the office of the Chief Sustainability Officer at Penn State. And our mission is really to help institutionalize sustainability into teaching, research, outreach, community engagement, and operations at Penn State. And when you're talking about a organization that has 24 campuses, 100,000 students, more than 30,000 staff and employees, that's not something that our little office of 12 people can do alone. Really, what we're trying to do is to serve as networkers and facilitators and try to help other people figure out how they can own sustainability at Penn State. And that very much is the same thing for the mission of the GreenGov Council. Mark and Matt, amazing as they are, cannot fix sustainability for the entire Pennsylvania state government, but they can serve as conveners and networkers trying to bring people together to be their own solutions to sustainability challenges that we all face. So this partnership has really been a fruitful one for us to think about how can we network between Penn State and the state government and with all of you to build a broader network and community around sustainability. And I think that's especially critical given the topic that we're talking about today, which is climate change. And this is a very apropos moment, as I think probably most people on the call know. We are in the last days of the COP26 negotiations in Glasgow, where we're trying to see what the global framework for trying to tackle climate change looks like. And we are very excited to have our guests today to help us think through this. Our thought for today was really to think about Where are the commitments that are happening now in Pennsylvania around climate? So Mark is going to talk briefly at the beginning about the GreenGov Council and what Pennsylvania's current commitments are in trying to reduce its climate carbon emissions. And then we're going to hear from Rob Cooper from Penn State. And Rob is going to talk about Penn State as an example of an institution here in Pennsylvania and what our commitments are currently in terms of trying to reduce our carbon emissions. And then we will hear from Meg Boyle, who will tell us what's happening at COP26 and what they're saying we need to be doing in terms of our reductions in emissions if we actually want to be able to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. So before they speak, let me give you a brief introduction to the guest. You've already heard from Mark, who is, of course, the head of the GreenGov Council in Pennsylvania. But Rob Cooper is the Senior Director of Energy and Sustainability in the Penn State office of the physical plant, where his office is responsible for the utilities and environmental systems at the University Park campus and provides engineering support to all 23 Commonwealth campuses. Rob has worked at Penn State for more than 30 years, championing and implementing more efficient operations. He was part of the steering committee that negotiated Penn State's solar power purchase agreement with Lightsource BP in 2019, and he is currently the co-chair of the university's carbon emissions reduction task force. And I can think of nobody better who can speak to what Penn State's commitments are in this realm. Dr. Meg Boyle is originally from the Scranton area and recently completed a mid-career PhD in the Penn State Department of Geography, focused on the significance of the Paris Climate Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals for climate vulnerable communities, with particular emphasis on how local priorities are reflected in international climate commitments. Meg has been working on climate issues for more than 20 years, and prior to joining Penn State, she worked in Washington, D.C. as a climate change grant maker, policy analyst and advocate, and coalition convener. She has especially worked in youth climate leadership development as a founding member of the Energy Action Coalition, where she launched a program of climate change initiatives spanning approximately 500 college campuses across the United States and Canada. She has been connecting local and global action by facilitating civil society engagement with the international climate negotiations since 2005, when she led the largest observer delegation to the UN climate negotiations in Montreal. So I think you can see we're in great hands with our speakers today, and I will turn it over first to Mark to talk a little bit, give us a grounding of what Pennsylvania's commitments are. Mark.
Thanks, Peter. Just as an overview, many of you know, but just as an overview for those that do not, Pennsylvania, the Governor Wolf signed Executive Order 2019-01, which was the first climate reduction goal in Pennsylvania under a governor, and it established essentially the Paris Agreement goals of 26% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2025 and 80% reduction of net greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 compared to 2005 levels. And so this was a significant executive order. This is actually how the GreenGov Council came to be in the first place. And so I'm obviously happy that this exists for multiple reasons. Pennsylvania is not alone. We are a member of the U.S. Climate Alliance, and the states in green you can see here. I believe it's 24 other states, 24 governors that also signed the U.S. Climate Alliance, which essentially agrees to the Paris agreements and the climate reduction goals, and to track and report progress and accelerate green and sustainable policies. So I know that myself and Matt and I, we work with member states in the U.S. Climate Alliance to talk about how other states are meeting the same goals and how we can improve upon that as an organization and as a group. And so and then as part of the executive order, just to sort of wrap this up, because when I get to Rob's presentation, is agencies specifically have lead by example goals under that carbon commitment. And you can see them here. We have goals to reduce energy consumption in state agencies 3% per year. We have a goal to replace passenger vehicles with battery electric and plug-ins. We also have a renewable energy offset goal to have 40% of our electricity come from clean renewable sources. And in the spring, we announced PA Pulse in Pennsylvania, which would be a 50% when it's constructed in Pennsylvania. It'll be a 50% commitment to solar for Pennsylvania agencies. So we're well on our way there. And then we also have under buildings, we are looking to build new buildings and all major renovations to high performance standards. And so I just wanted to give you that as just as an overview. You can go to dgs.pa.gov/GreenGov. We have 2 annual reports where we've started to track progress over time. Matt and I are working on this year's annual progress report, and so look for that towards the January timeframe when you'll see where we are for this next calendar year. And so with all that, I just want to get right to Rob and his presentation for Penn State University itself. Go ahead, Rob.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes describing the various strategies that Penn State's Office of Physical Plan has implemented over the years to reduce our operational carbon emissions. But first, I'll start by talking about Penn State's greenhouse gas inventory. Next slide. So greenhouse gas inventory for Penn State, we complete one every year on a fiscal basis, and the inventory includes an estimation of direct emissions from university property, emissions related to the production of our purchased electricity, and third-party emissions from a few other sectors that include university-sponsored air travel and faculty, staff, and student commuting. The pie chart there at the top illustrates that 75% of the university's emissions come from the energy sector, which is defined as small and large stationary sources and our purchased electricity. And the pie chart on the bottom illustrates that the majority of Penn State's emissions occur at the University Park campus. Next slide. So prior to 2005, Penn State was growing, and so was our carbon footprint, as shown on this graph. And in 2005, we established carbon reduction goals illustrated by the horizontal green dotted lines. The top green line illustrates a goal of a 17.5% reduction goal by 2012. The middle horizontal green line illustrates a goal of a 35% reduction by 2020. And then the bottom green dotted line illustrates an aspirational goal of an 80% reduction by 2050. So we met both the 2012 goal of a 17.5% reduction and the 2020 goal of a 35% reduction. Next slide. So this colored wedge chart illustrates how Penn State's been able to achieve its greenhouse gas reductions. The top of the wedges illustrates where we might have been without the reduction strategies. And the solid blue line indicates actual emissions. And each colored wedge illustrates the reduction associated with the particular program. For example, on the top there, the rust-colored wedge is the reduction from the installation of a combustion turbine and a heat recovery steam generator at our East Campus steam plant back in 2011. The combustion turbine produces on-site electricity from the combustion of natural gas, and the heat recovery steam generator captures waste heat from the turbine and makes steam, making our campus district heating system more efficient, and it lowers our greenhouse gas emissions. The light blue wedge is the reduction from a large project that converted our West Campus steam plant from burning coal to burning natural gas. The large purple wedge in the center is the energy savings program, and that's the strategy that's responsible for the majority of the university's reductions to date. This program annually funds $12 to $15 million of building energy conservation projects and utility system efficiency improvements. Projects range from tuning up existing buildings in order to optimize their performance, building HVAC system upgrades, updating of temperature controls, lighting fixture retrofits, installation of occupancy sensors, envelope improvements, and much more. The bright red wedge shows the greenhouse gas emission reductions from our recent offsite solar energy purchase that Peter mentioned. This large offsite solar project was developed by a company called LightSource BP. Next slide. The The 3 sites that make up the solar project will generate 100 million kilowatt hours in year 1 and lower Penn State's greenhouse gas emissions by 57,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year. The project was completed in October of 2020, and it's still the largest solar project in Pennsylvania to date, consisting of 150,000 solar panels on a roughly 500 acres down in Franklin County, Pennsylvania. Next slide. A project that's currently under construction involves the installation of an additional combustion turbine and heat recovery steam generator at our West Campus steam plant. This new combustion turbine will produce on-site electricity, and the new heat recovery steam generator will capture the waste heat and make steam, again, making the campus distribution heating system even more efficient and further lowering our greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. This combustion turbine project is expected to be operational near the end of this year, any day now, and will lower greenhouse gas emissions by 16,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year, as indicated by the light orange wedge at the bottom of the chart. Next slide. So this slide shows the accumulated effects of strategies that reduce energy consumption at our University Park campus. The solid blue line indicates the campus energy consumption from 1975 through up into 2020. And the dotted blue line indicates the University Park is using the same total energy it was in as it was back in 1995, even though we have 8 million square feet more of utilities now than we did back in 1995. Next slide. You can click through those, yep. Now this slide shows the cumulative effect of the strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at University Park. The solid red line indicates emissions again from 1975 to 2020. And the dotted red line indicates that University Park greenhouse gas emissions have been reduced to pre-1975 levels, even while adding 9 million square feet of facilities since then, as indicated by that green line. We can do it. A couple clicks there. Yep. And while we've made good progress towards lowering Penn State's greenhouse gas emissions through financially viable strategies, the scientific consensus is that we need to do much more and we need to do it faster. So in June, Penn State's President Eric Barron created the Carbon Emission Reduction Task Force with the charge to, number 1, review the current greenhouse gas emissions inventory and make changes as necessary to the sectors to be included in the goal, if any. Number 2, to reconsider the current goal of 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, with a view to setting a more aggressive yet attainable goal such as carbon neutrality or carbon negative, as well as the revised timeline that would be needed to achieve that new goal. Number 3, provide specific, actionable, practical, and economically viable recommendations to position Penn State as a leader in greenhouse gas reduction efforts. And then number 4, to wrap that all up and put it in a report to the president by the end of this year. So stay tuned. There's much more to come from this task force effort. And that's the end of my presentation. I'll turn it back over to Mark or Peter.
Thank you so much, Rob. And now I'm delighted to introduce Meg Boyle to talk on a very up-to-date talk that I know she was finishing all the way up through 7 last night as COP26 keeps changing underneath us. So Meg, take it away.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Rob, for that. So yes, I have to give a lot of credit to the Sustainability Institute and to Pennsylvania and GreenGov, because this is certainly the most punctual and proactive debrief I've ever been a part of about international climate negotiations, in that this is to the hour, to the minute, when negotiations were scheduled to end in Glasgow today. They are, at least someone can update me, but as I was checking on my phone as we were all joining together, They do seem to be running over, frankly, which is pretty normal for negotiations. So in some number of hours or at some point this weekend, those negotiations will officially conclude. Next slide. So we thought it would be fun, given that, just to layer on some of the international context for institutional and state climate action. I recognize that we probably have some folks on the call who are incredibly expert in the international negotiations process and in links between local, state, and international action. So one, thank you for being here, and two, please don't be shy about bringing those things to the conversation. We'll leave plenty of time for discussion. But in the meantime, I recognize there might be some of you who are brand new to the international climate process. So I do, just for 1 minute, want to briefly touch on what we talk about when we say COP26. Reflect on, in the long history of international climate meetings, why this one might be particularly special or important. Give you a brief preview of some of the key issues that'll be wrapping up over the next hours or days in Glasgow, and then finally lead us into a discussion of how Pennsylvania connects to all of that and how some Pennsylvania stakeholders find these meetings useful in their work. Next slide. Okay, so the short version of the long history of international climate negotiations. COP26 references the 26th Conference of the Parties, meaning countries, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So there is this body within the UN called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is countries working together on climate change. And then within that bigger working group, they will spin off processes and working groups as needed. So for instance, the international climate agreement that we have right now, the Paris Climate Agreement, you can imagine there's quite an overwhelming amount of discussion happening there. So on that particular agreement, there's a series of dedicated meetings and so on and so forth. Broadly, this process is set up to help countries collaborate on a number of things. One is climate science. So this process responds to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change guidance, and most recently has set a goal of countries coming together to keep average global temperature rise as far below 2 degrees Celsius as possible, and ideally as close to or below 1.5 degrees Celsius as possible. To that end, countries work together to mitigate climate change and to support technology transfer between countries that's needed for that to happen, to adapt to climate change, and to deliver climate finance to developing countries that they need to make that adaptation happen. And last, but certainly not least, a relatively new discussion around loss and damage. So this is the idea that there are already some catastrophic climate impacts which we cannot prevent and to which we cannot adapt. So this is a discussion about responsibility and response to those things. There's a much longer conversation that we could have about developing and developed countries in this process, but for now, suffice it to say that the international climate process has always recognized that developing countries and developed countries have different responsibilities for climate change historically and different capabilities for dealing with it moving forward. So where we're at in the process right now, the Paris Agreement just had its 5th birthday. There's a bit of a myth around the Paris Agreement that somehow everything got finished in Paris, which in some sense is true. But what happened in Paris was a broad strokes, big picture agreement. And then countries had to continue to hash out the operational and technical details of how that works on the ground on a day-to-day basis. So that's what countries have been up to the past few years, is coming up with that rule book for how the Paris Agreement works. As well as bringing to the table their nationally determined contributions, which is important because the Paris Agreement relies on every country individually to come forward and articulate what it can do. So now that most of that is done, countries have come forward with their contributions. Many have even updated their contributions. The rule book is pretty much done. Now we're moving into this next phase where, 5 years in, countries are looking at, okay, how are we doing individually relative to our goals, and where are we at collectively, and what might we need to do differently moving forward to meet those temperature targets. And the last thing is just to say there's a late breaking update this week that the next meetings have been set. So the next international negotiation will be in Egypt next year, followed by the United Arab Emirates the next year. So that's something to put on your calendar if you're thinking about participating. We'll talk more about how you can do that, but this is essentially like the Olympics in some sense. You have a host body and also a host country rotating around the world, and they get together to host these meetings on an ongoing basis. All right, next slide. And so this is a great graphic from Climate Action Tracker. They have a lot of wonderful resources if you're not familiar. And this is just to show that the world is better off with the Paris Agreement in regards to climate change than without it. But the policies and actions in practice that we have are lagging a bit behind the commitments that we've made on paper, and those commitments on paper in turn are lagging behind where we want to be on global temperature rise. So all of that leads us to a lot of work still to be done and the context for this particular set of climate negotiations. Next slide. Okay, so some of what might be particularly unique or important about this particular climate negotiations. I'm sure all of you have probably seen something about the negotiations in the media over the past couple of weeks. That actually has not always been the case. This is fairly recent. We are seeing something like, I think there were 3 times as many members of the media at this particular negotiation as compared to the last one. So that's great in that, I think we back home have more opportunity to engage with the meetings and to know what's going on. Related to that is what is a culture of announcements. You might actually hear this called an announcement COP, meaning that there are a lot of new commitments and initiatives being announced in Glasgow over the last couple of weeks. These include announcements from major emerging economies. So India, South Africa, Brazil, China, these countries that are responsible for an increasing share of global emissions are updating us on what they're doing. We've seen a lot of announcements from the US around new initiatives and contributions to adaptation finance, among other things. We've seen joint announcements, particularly from the United States and China. There are coalition announcements. So if you're looking at those, you might want to look for the Climate Vulnerable Forum or the High Ambition Coalition as important coalitions in this climate process. There have also been a number of sectoral announcements. So new plans on things like methane reduction, transportation emissions, and avoided tropical deforestation across countries. So along with those announcements, as you might expect, there's a lot of what we call quote unquote high-level engagement. So you've probably seen the royal family, heads of state, celebrities wandering around these meetings. There's a fairly active and interesting conversation around how that is helpful in terms of driving ambition and attention to the process, and how it becomes challenging in terms of the logistics of getting work done and those career technical negotiators and all the things that they just need to, nitty-gritty things that they need to do on a daily basis. The last thing that I want to touch on here is the breadth of these meetings. So in any given year, a lot of things get discussed at climate negotiations, perhaps because last year's meetings were postponed due to COVID and moved to this year. There is this year a particular breadth of conversations, both formal and informal. So whatever aspect of climate change you're working on, from agriculture and food systems to ocean carbon, chances are you can find something in these conversations for you. Last but certainly not least, as you all know, the United States is back in this process under the new administration, and they have been out in force to make that point. So again, with these announcements, we're also seeing President Biden at the meetings, former President Obama at the meetings, several of the cabinet and agency leads, a very large congressional delegation from the House and Senate attended the meetings. And so on and so forth. So large US presence at these meetings. Next slide. Okay, so this is just to give you some context and a sense of the place. On the upper right here is the actual negotiations venue. Most negotiations venues look like this. They're these like miles long temporary buildings, airplane hangar kind of feel. On the lower left, that's what a typical plenary negotiations room would look like. And on the lower right here, you can see this is some of the queue outside the meeting venues over the past 2 weeks. So this speaks to the some of the challenges of negotiating in person during COVID. Just getting everyone through the testing in the morning, in addition to security checks. People were standing in these lines on a daily basis. So your civil society representatives, your country representatives are certainly committed, I will say, to climate action for standing in that line each and every day. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so again, a lot of this is changing actually in real time. But I want to just, if we have time, just very, very briefly touch on a couple of the interesting things that might come out of the meetings this weekend. One thing to keep an eye on is just review timeline and process. So this conversation is ongoing. This is the idea that if our commitments are not quite adequate, should we be updating them sooner? Should we be updating one another on our progress more frequently? Do all our commitments need to start in the same year so they're easier to compare? What kind of transparency do we need to have around sharing information? So all of those things are under discussion. The second one, the fossil fuels phase out, is quite interesting. For the first time, there was language in a draft text around the phase out of coal and fossil fuel subsidies. My understanding is that that language has been weakened somewhat in the latest draft, but some countries are still having heartburn about it being there, so it remains to be seen where that language comes out at this particular meeting, but that's a very interesting precedent. We briefly mentioned loss and damage. This is a positive bright light out of these meetings, so this is quite a contentious issue because developed countries are frequently cautious about anything that would imply their liability or responsibility for compensation for climate loss and damage. But Scotland has stepped forward and made a leadership gesture of contributing money to a loss and damage fund. So that's quite hopeful, as is some of the language that's still in the text, which is more aggressive, I think, than some folks were hoping for. Just to touch on another couple things here very briefly, you have probably heard markets or Article 6 mentioned. This is also still shaking out. This is the idea around is climate action, use it or lose it. So if you had permission to pollute in the past and you didn't, can you still do it now? Or did you miss your opportunity in some sense? And then a conversation around double counting. So we want to be making sure that if countries are claiming, emissions reductions that are happening overseas, that both countries aren't counting those reductions at the same time, which is also part of this net zero lingo that you've probably been hearing, and the idea that we want to reach a balance of emissions going into and coming out of the atmosphere by mid-century, but of course, still being concerned with what we're doing in the short term. We talked a little bit about this relationship between text and announcements and the fact that we're in a learning laboratory of how an announcement COP affects progress on all of these other things. And then the last thing as we transition into my final point here is just to say it's also worth keeping an eye on some of the atmospherics that are happening around these meetings right now in terms of civil society engagement and a push that's coming particularly from some of the youth constituencies and climate vulnerable country representatives around the potential recognition of a climate emergency, much like COVID-19, and hoping that that would create international resources to deal with climate change on a new scale. Next slide. This is just to show you what the official Framework Convention on Climate Change website looks like. I believe you'll have access to some resources after today, but you may want to check this out if you're interested and new to climate negotiations. There's everything from webcasts of the meetings to instructions on how to sign up to go in future and so on and so forth. So that should be your starting point for more resources on all of those things. Next slide. Okay, in wrapping up, I just want to mention a few ways that Pennsylvania stakeholders, particularly from civil society, engage in these meetings. One is just, again, to stress that you can go in person across a range of constituencies that the UN recognizes. They make provisions for you to be able to sign up an organization and through that organization yourself to attend these meetings. And once there, people use the meetings in a variety of ways, everything from making presentations to meeting with delegations to engaging with the media to participating in large marches. So I think, and external pressure tactics. So I think at one point during these meetings, there were something like 100,000 people in the midway point in the streets of Glasgow. I've heard from people who participate, whether it's from back home or at the meetings, and who are doing primarily state or local work, that the international meetings nonetheless represent an opportunity for them to amplify attention to certain issues that are very important to them in their work, as well as to share and receive best practices. So there may be another community that could use your advice or is in a similar situation and might have some advice to give. And we can, of course, talk more about all that. But for now, I will leave it there. Next slide, please. So this is just to show you, this is the upper left here, we have Congressman Boyle, who represents the Norristown area, was part of the congressional delegation to the meetings. He is no relation, by the way. We have Mayor Peduto from Pittsburgh, was in Glasgow this week, among many other things, to formalize a sister cities relationship, which is very cool, between Pittsburgh and Glasgow. And then finally, this is just to give you some sense of what the people in the streets during the past 2 weeks have looked like from Glasgow. All right, next slide. And next slide, let's go one more. I'm just going to put my contact information up. Feel free to reach out if you want to talk more about any of these things. Yeah, thank you very much, and I will leave it there to leave us some time to talk.
Excellent. Thanks, Meg and Rob. And I'm going to turn the recording off here, and we can, let's see, stop.